The Noahide movement nowadays is still very young. Could you give us your reflections on the very start and the current situation, Rabbi Skobac?
It seems pretty clear to me that the Noahide movement today is at a pioneering stage in its development, meaning that there really hasn't been a serious movement of B'nai Noach, of Noachides, until fairly recently. You know, going back 100 years ago, there really weren't any kind of movement of Noachides. There may have been individuals. So we're talking about a relatively new movement. It's not new in the fact that it never existed before, but this is the modern manifestation of this movement that's been around for a very long time. And I think that when we think about a pioneering stage, so what does that mean? So I'm not sure this example resonates with Europeans, but when Americans went out west, right? I mean, Americans started going to dig for gold in the 1800s in California. Those were pioneers. In California, when they first went out to find gold, there were no schools, there were no stores, there were no resources, there was nothing. You went out there and you had to somehow fend for yourself. You had to make do. You had to educate your children by yourself. There were no resources. And that's how the Noahide movement started in the 1980s, where there were very few resources at all. There were very few rabbis back then who were even willing to talk to Noachides, because there was an assumption that these were Christians that wanted to become a fifth column in the Jewish community. So there was very little openness to the Noahide movement. And slowly a few rabbis became open to the Noahide movement. But basically, it's a movement that really is, I think at this stage, trying to develop resources, leadership, and most importantly, critical mass, meaning that what I've experienced is that in any part of the world, except for two exceptions, there are very, very small Noahide communities. You may have 5 or 10 people in this city, 5 or 10 people in that city, but it's very difficult to be part of such a small community. If you're single, who do you date? How do you get your kids educated? There aren't the ability to have resources when you have such a small community. So what will be happening over the coming decades will be the growth of the Noahide movement, so that you have sizable communities where with a sizable community, you can develop resources, leadership, etc. Now, the second thing I wanted to just mention briefly is that one of the questions that I'm asked most often is the question of Noahide identity. Noachides often ask me, how should I see myself? How should I, in the greater scheme of things, what does it mean to be a Noahide? And the answer I've been given lately is that a person who embraces the Noahide path should basically see themselves as if they're living in the book of Genesis. Now, this may not be totally accurate, but for me, it's helpful, because in the book of Genesis, there's no Torah, there's no Judaism, and you basically have human beings that are trying to live righteously and have relationships with God. And indeed, in the book of Genesis, we find there are people who know God, there are people who have relationships with God, there are people who are living righteously before God. They don't have access to a Torah. They don't have to worry about all the questions that bother so many Noachites today. Can I wear a talit? Can I keep kosher? Can I put a mezuzah up? Can I observe Shabbat? Can I observe Passover? These were not questions in the book of Genesis. There were no such things. So I think it's helpful to think about what it's like to be a human being in the book of Genesis, and what does it mean for one's spiritual path. And I think that may be a very simple model for Noahide identity. I'm a child of God, and I'm just like it was back in the book of Genesis, and it keeps things simple. The third thing I like to say, and this is also, I think, an important thing to bear in mind. Many of the Noahides that I speak to are frustrated because they find that things are not clear. There's confusion. They're not getting clear, simple answers. And there are reasons for this. And let me suggest one or two reasons. Let's think about how Judaism works. Today in Judaism, when questions come up, we invariably don't look to the Bible for answers, meaning that there are very few things. If a modern Jew wanted to find out, for example, can I use a microwave oven on Shabbat? So you're not going to be able to find that anywhere in the Bible. The way Judaism has worked, meaning that the functioning, the working of Judaism over the past thousands of years has been through a living legal process, meaning that we have the basic revelation of God, which was through the Torah, the written Torah, the oral Torah. And then we've had the application of that revelation over the centuries by the sages, by the judges, by the leading Jewish scholars. And this is what we call the process of questions and answers. In Hebrew, she'elot v'tshuvot. And this is how Judaism has worked, meaning that when a question comes up, a Jew will ask their local rabbi. Now, by the time, we've come now, there have been so many books written that many times you can look up answers in a book. But oftentimes there are no books that deal with this question. And so you have to submit the question to a rabbi. And the rabbi, if they're a learned rabbi, will try to come up with an answer. And that's how Judaism develops, through this process of questions and answers. The problem for the Noahide community is that these questions and answers have not been developing over the past thousands of years. You've never had before in history, at least in recent history, non-Jews coming to rabbis and asking us questions. That's not been the Jewish experience. The Jewish experience has been non-Jews trying to kill us. So for the first time in hundreds and thousands of years, we have non-Jews calling us up and emailing us up and asking us, Rabbi, can we do this? Can we do that? So this is the beginning of the process, but it hasn't happened now, meaning that we've gone for so many years, hundreds and thousands of years, where these questions have not been asked. And so now it's only several decades, since the late 1980s, that people have been asking these questions. And then, as I said before, who's going to answer these questions? Not many rabbis are involved with the Noahide movement, and very few rabbis have even studied these questions in terms of what is the law for non-Jews. It's not the kind of question that most rabbis have been trained to even answer. So we're talking about a process that really is just beginning to take place, and the wheels are squeaky, and the resources are sparse. And unfortunately, when people are in the pioneering stage, you have to have a little bit of patience, because to get this movement really moving, it's going to take time for many reasons. When people ask me questions, I'm fortunate that here in Toronto, we have one of the leading rabbis in the world. So I'm not smart enough to be able to answer the questions that come to me. So I'm able to ask questions of this great rabbi here in Toronto, Rabbi Shlomo Miller. So the question that I'm asked most often is, can Noahides observe Shabbat, the Sabbath? So I always had my suspicions. I've always had what I think the answer should be, but who am I? I'm not a great Torah scholar. I'm not a great sage. So I was able to ask this question of Rabbi Shlomo Miller, and he basically confirmed my suspicions, which, just to say it in two words, we can discuss it later if you want. which is that non-Jews are allowed to honor the Sabbath, which means to do the positive things like make the Sabbath a special day for having special meals with family, special time for Torah study, special time for prayer, lighting candles, but should not observe the Sabbath in the way that Jews abstain from thousands of different kinds of prohibited activities. That non-Jews, there's no reason why a non-Jew should avoid answering their phone on the Sabbath, should avoid turning lights on and off, should avoid going in a car if they want to take a nice ride in the country, etc. But these are questions that have never been asked. And so these are the kind of questions that have to now slowly be asked. And I'll just share one more thought on this, which is that in Judaism, we don't have absolute uniformity. So when a question comes up, you may have several different answers to the same question that are different. For example, can a Noahide put a mezuzah on their door? So I've asked the question, and I was given the answer that yes, they could put a mezuzah on the doors inside their house if they know how to treat it properly and they are serious b'nai Noach, but they shouldn't put it on their front door because it may give the impression that they're a Jew. Now, I've heard other rabbis say, no, people that are not Jewish should not put a mezuzah up anywhere. And so what you have here are two different answers. What do? You don't have a mental breakdown. You basically say to yourself what Jews say to themselves. I have my rabbi, I have my authority, and that's what I follow. I asked the question, and my religious guide said that it's permissible. The fact that someone else was told not to, don't worry about that, right? You have to, as the Talmud says, aseh lecha rav, you have to find yourself a spiritual guide. And don't worry about the fact that there are other points of view. Don't expect uniformity. That's not the way Judaism is. It's not the way the Noahide movement's going to be. We're not going to have a one-size-fits-all Noahide movement. There will be different approaches, different streams, different styles. The Talmud says that when the Jews crossed the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds, there were 12 lanes that opened up. It wasn't just one lane that they all marched through. So there is diversity, and it's healthy. Many people don't relate to that well. They get very nervous when there are differences. But my message is you have to learn how to deal with it because that's reality.